The next topic for discussion is research trends in English for specific purposes classroom. We are going to look at the trends and issues that are there in ESP classroom. A lot of research has been conducted in order to determine and assess the trends and issues with regard to ESP classroom situation. And according to Long, general language for no purpose. A course which is general course, it does not have any purpose. At any proficiency level, almost always teach too much. So if there is no purpose, no specific purpose given for that course, then the danger is that that type of course sometimes teach too much. That is vocabulary, skills, registers or styles some learners do not need, and too little, for example, omitting lexemes and genres that they do. So in terms of the needs of the learners, sometimes they are teaching too much, the type of information that learners don't need, and sometimes they omit the information that is required by the learner. Instead of a one-size-fits-all approach that one course is going to fulfill all the requirements of the learners, it is more defensible to view every course as involving specific purposes. So the idea is to streamline the specific purposes, and based on those specific purposes, the courses should be designed. Another definition by Hutchinson and Waters says, tell me what you need English for, and I'll tell you the English that you need. So why you need English for? What is the purpose? What is the goal? What is the purpose and goal of your particular course? Why you need English? And if that is defined, only then the methodology or the content should be determined to suit those needs. Teaching learning ESP is said to be specialty oriented, as it is submitted to specific professional needs of students. So it is specialty oriented. It is not random. It is not general, as it is aimed to fulfill the special requirement and special needs of its learners. The emerging trends in ESP are that teaching and learning is to create such an environment where students' knowledge construction can be facilitated. So the idea behind having ESP classroom is that learning and teaching both should be able to create such an environment where the process of knowledge construction can be facilitated. Such an environment is one in which students are challenged without being frustrated. So the learning is a challenging task. The learner needs to comprehend it and should be motivated to learn, but the process should not be frustrating. It should not put stress on learners, and the learner is frustrated, he or she is going to be demotivated. So the task should be challenging to involve, to motivate, and not to demotivate learner. The task in which they are focused on intentional learning to fulfill set of learning goals. So they are intentionally involved in the process. It requires the active participation, which can only be seen if the learners are not frustrated. ESP digital learning environment, that is learner-centered, knowledge-centered, community-centered, and assessment-centered. And all these kind of centeredness, you do not see teacher's role. It's primarily learner-centered, where the knowledge needs to be constructed, has to be reinforced by the community, has to be assessed by the learner himself or herself. Then we have the concept of blended learning, which is the type of learning where you see the combination of online digital media with traditional classroom methods, and it does require the physical presence of both teacher and students, with some element of student control over time, place, path or pace. So that's why it is called blended learning, because it combines the online as well as the traditional classroom setting. And in addition to blended learning, the attitudes of ESP students toward it needs to be looked at. That are they positive about the blended learning, or they feel intimidated in the presence of this kind of teaching approach? So the attitude of the learners is very crucial in order to have blended learning and its desired outcome. Fazli argues technology-based course is best regarded as a student motivator. So as contrary to the traditional classroom setting, they feel that the technology-based course is more essential or effective in order to enhance students' motivation. The other is replacing traditional ESP classroom with flipped classroom. Flipped classroom, as we all know, is an instructional strategy and basically a type of blended learning that reverses the traditional learning environment basically by delivering instructional content often online or outside of the classroom. So it takes or moves activities, including those that they may have traditionally been considered homework, into classrooms. So the traditional classroom setting is where students are given homework, but the flipped classroom is bringing the classroom or the outside learning into the classroom. Authentic material for situated learning. A situation needs to be given, and if the situation has to be given, the learner should be provided with the authentic material. The last and not the least point is the training for skill gap analysis. The skill gap analysis is basically the assessment of the current state and how based on that assessment you formulate a desired state. So assessing the gap analysis is again something which has been seen as an emerging trend in ESP classroom. Now we will look at ESP trends and issues in Pakistani context. We see that the number of trends and issues that have been highlighted in our Pakistani context include EGP, that is English for General Purposes, versus ESP, content appropriacy and relevancy, class size, teaching practices, teachers' lack of expertise, and then learners' motivation. Now coming back to EGP and ESP issues, we see that the kind of intake that we have, the students who come to the intermediate level or in our schools and colleges, they come with weak English proficiency skills. Now the task for the teachers become highly demanding, that they have to build the foundation first and then expose them to ESP environment, which requires the development of specific skills. Content appropriacy and relevancy is another issue. The content which are there in our textbooks do not meet the needs of our learners. So we have always observed that the need analysis is the part which has not been taken into account in terms of developing the content. Authentic material is not used. The content which is there in those textbooks are not cultural specific. So this is another issue that is there in our ESP classroom setting. Class size. The class size of English courses is a major challenge for today's ESP practitioners. It's huge. The number of students who are attending, they are huge in number, and they simply the purpose of giving specific specialized skills to each and every individual becomes very difficult for the teacher. Teaching practices. The specific teaching practices in terms of designing activities, following the updated methodologies, technologies, again, all these things pose a great challenge for the teachers. Teachers' lack of expertise as far as English for specific purposes is concerned is also seen as a major issue. The teachers who design these courses, they lack the specific specialty or specialization for those specific purposes, which ultimately turns into demotivation on the part of the learners, because the learner is not motivated in terms of being alien to the environment of the classroom. He finds the material without any objectives, without any concrete goals, and the methodologies are also, in terms of creating interaction or participations, do not fulfill their purpose. So we have EGP versus ESP issues, appropriacy matter with regard to content, class size, teaching practices, teachers' lack of expertise, and learners' motivation. Learners' motivation is very important, especially for the ESP teachers, because if they would not maintain the motivation level, the mastering of specific task or language in order to use for specific purposes become more challenging and will demonstrate lack of enthusiasm on the part of the learner. Then we have the trends which says that learner-centeredness approach is considered as more appropriate approach for designing ESP syllabus. As ESP is goal-oriented, students do not learn the English language for the sake of it, but because they need to learn it in order to communicate a set of professional skills. The other trend that is to be considered is about knowledge, which is constructed in the context of environment in which it is encountered through the social and collaborative process. So the knowledge which is to be given has to take into account the social context and the environmental context. It says that 21st century classroom needs students to face real world problems that engage them in higher order thinking skills, creativity, innovation, communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and problem solving. So we need to take these as the challenging tasks or the basis for our ESP practices, especially in the non-native scenario, that we need to equip our students with all these higher order thinking skills. For effective ESP learning, construction of knowledge happens in a social context. So in all these points, the number of researchers that have conducted studies, they have highlighted that for ESP, we need to provide higher order thinking skills and those thinking skills with regard to the social context. Students join in manipulating materials and thus create community of learners who build their own knowledge together. So the idea is that for ESP teaching practices, we need to have goal directions, specific needs analysis to have been conducted, goals should have been determined, the environment should have been determined, and the skills need to be inculcated in order to enable the learners to perform successfully in any given social context. So to conclude, ESP is an approach to language teaching which aims to meet learners' particular needs and includes specialized programs which are designed to develop the communicative use of English in a specialized field of science, work, or technology.